The Trump-era prosecutor's report, which, as I've told you, legally cleared Biden of any potential crime involving classified material. Declined to charge. Same result as, say, Mike Pence. But in places, that report, as I bet you've heard, unloaded on the president because he had said he didn't remember certain things. And some of those answers that are in the report as not part of Biden's memory are things the president actually disputes. He says he does remember, for example, the dark, somber fact of when his son died. Now, tonight, it's dialing up. Axios reporting Republicans' partisan plans to try to exploit and run with this as a matter of governance. I use that word specifically. You see the headlines here about using subpoena powers to get weeks or months of hearings to hype just those parts of the report, not, of course, the part clearing Biden. Some admit Republicans don't think it even matters what they find. Now, that confession is in the article about the Republican plans, which itself sounds damning. And I want to tell you tonight, it's not sufficient to say, this is just politics. Politics is, of course, something a lot of people tune out precisely because there's so much spin and crap. And that's been true for a long time. Politics is what candidates and campaigns say. It can be hype, spin, exaggeration. I'm not saying false equivalence, but that's politics. This is about a government probe, which actually cleared Biden, just as it cleared Pence. But the Biden version pushed irrelevant and negative material from a Trump-era prosecutor that Merrick Garland thought it was necessary to pick to not have just a standard career nonpartisan prosecutor. And now another branch of government wants to use government powers to build on that for political purposes. As for the law here, none other than the former Attorney General of the United States just told us his sober assessment of the Trump prosecutor appointed by Garland.
The language that he used and the focus that he put on certain matters, I think, is out of bounds. He's either extremely naive or he is a partisan, and he's thinking, I want to have a life beyond what I'm saying in connection with this investigation, and that might have shaded what he put in the report.
Now, that's a pretty diplomatic audit of the report. Other veterans of DOJ and other legal experts, independent experts, have been tougher on this prosecutor who basically tried to play doctor and cherry-picking Biden's answers, and others are practically pretending the report is some kind of comprehensive medical finding.
It's an age problem, and it's bad.
Isn't almost a dementia state of mind?
He needs to take a cognitive test.
I'm glad reporters are asking him very hard questions about the age issue, because I do think, frankly, this issue is almost undercovered.
This is about a person with cognitive decline.
Now, that's MAGA political spin. If it were just MAGA anti-Biden people talking to each other only in that Fox bubble, that'd be one thing. Frankly, be typical for a lot of today's political discourse. But D.C. elites, pundits, and some reporters are actually responding to the report I mentioned by ditching factual standards, by shoehorning some sort of amateur set of medical opinions to attack the president. Some are using a kind of false equivalence to ask if Biden's age, which is, of course, close to Trump's, is somehow equal to or as bad as Trump's criminal indictments. Does that sound like overstatement? Well, here is a national news headline from, as you see, CNN. Is Biden's age now a bigger problem than Trump's indictments? Let me read that again. It's the red item there with the arrow. You're watching MSNBC, but I'm showing you CNN's banner for a reason. Is Biden's age now a bigger problem than Trump's indictments? The answer, substantively, is, of course, no. This is a news channel I'm showing you there. News shapes views. It can shape politics. It's not supposed to drive you towards some certain outcome. I'm certainly not trying to do that. But I want to show you a question this dumb and lopsided does shape views in a way that might be distortive. So let me answer the question posed here by that particular program. No, getting older is not a bigger problem or a similar problem to being indicted several times over hard criminal evidence. Now, whatever the reasoning or the motives, this is a sampling of the kind of D.C. groupthink that I've actually told you about before. The same elites talk to each other. They operate in a beltway bubble. And now, this week, it's snowballing into something where a long-sought report finding no criminal wrongdoing is being treated by some, and I emphasize some reputable outlets and reputable people. I'm not saying they're all terrible forever. I'm not a black and white type of reporter, quite frankly, but they're wrong on that headline. That it's now being treated as some sort of symbol for a partisan spin about a topic that is already fairly well known, that both leading candidates are on the older side.
President Biden facing new questions about his age and whether he's up for another term.
Is it too late for Democrats to change horses?
There have been long-standing, mounting questions about his age and mental sharpness.
The issue of age seems to continue to linger.
Don't try to convince people that he's not old, because he is.
Yes, this issue of age is lingering. Now, again, it is not out of bounds. In campaigns, particularly for the White House, there is a rigorous vetting process that involves all sorts of things that voters might care about. Biden obviously earned that trust last time. He is not beyond those same questions this time. Neither is the leading Republican candidate, both of whom are similarly aged. But when you see that one-sided response coming out of this DOJ report, including some people coming out of the news side, you can see something is up here. And I'll tell you, some of these folks are getting audited by knowledgeable people. I want to share with you something from a longtime D.C. observer, Judd Legum, who just wrote an account which methodically goes through how the New York Times, as one example, has been covering this. And I'm going to quote it for you at length. Quote, "The Times published 30 stories about Biden's alleged memory issues over those 4 days since the report. The story covered by 24 reporters, 4 opinion columnists, and the editorial board. The DOJ report there from the Trump prosecutor, quote, legally clearing Biden was described as a political disaster, a political nightmare, a new political crisis, a political mess. The paper said the report inflicted searing political damage. It placed Biden's advanced age back at the center of America's political conversation and constituted a, quote, gift to Republicans. Opinion columnists with no medical credentials said Biden showed, quote, signs of senescence, suggesting he was sliding, quote, into dementia. Another said Hur's report proved Biden should not be running for re-election. The editorial board described that report, I should say, ominously as a, quote, dark moment for the Biden presidency. Legum goes on to write, only one of those 20-plus stories mentioned a key fact. Hur is completely unqualified to render a judgment on Biden's mental capacity. End quote. Now, that's one influential outlet's coverage, one that does set agendas. And by the way, the Times not widely seen as pro-Trump or anything. As for the do not recall of it all, remember, all of this based on not, Biden stumbling through some interview in a way that was so different from any legal interview that's ever been conducted. But here's a person who, again, I'm not a medical expert, and I'm not discussing her mental health or mental capacities or her aging. But Ivanka Trump said, I don't recall 30 times just during the civil fraud trial alone. This age attack, this obsession by the right, this plan for hearings, which Axios has reported tonight, also reflects in a weird way a kind of political strength that exists, because Biden cleared the Democratic field memorably, even if it had, quote, younger options. He beat Trump handily. Republicans aren't exactly seeking a policy debate over, say, the jobs record, the job surge there, the stock surge, which includes record highs recently, the Obamacare enrollment surge, which affects a lot of people who might not have money in the stock market but need health care, an infrastructure law that's poured billions into many projects, including in places where Republicans not only don't want to debate Biden on it, they've been campaigning on it and sometimes trying to fool people about the fact that many Republicans opposed that spending before it was authorized. Now, another piece of this, again, is the longevity factor. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are unusual in that they have been famous for decades. If they'd started even earlier and happened to be even younger, there still might be a fatigue there. If you contrast that to other political stories, Kennedy, Clinton, Obama, these are individuals who popped up on the national scene and then won the presidency in a matter of years, certainly under a decade, if you talk about not news junkies, but random voters being aware of who they are. Well, random voters have known about Trump and Biden forever. As Outcast would say, forever, ever? So, there's also a political fatigue here. But that doesn't mean that the fatigue, which might exist and might hurt Biden or Trump or both of them, should turn into ageism or these weird speculations about how old either of them are. But we have these two candidates who in many measures are unpopular, and as I've told you, the fact they've been around for decades and run against each other before may not help them. There's no reason to think they're going to be more favorably viewed if they keep sticking around forever. But if you live long enough, yes, people will come at you for it. Remember the questions raised about the politician I just alluded to, then President Reagan. Like Biden, when he was running for re-election, age was a campaign issue. I don't think it was necessarily shoehorned into a government report like this. I don't know that the opposing party was doing what Axios says Republicans are about to do, but age was an issue. And facing that question, was he going to live long enough to become a villain based on this? Well, you may remember how that widely seen as charismatic leader turned the age question into a political moment that helped him.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
That one landed against his gray-haired opponent, Mondale, there. There was laughter in the room. There was a collective sigh around the country. There was a sense, not on partisanship, but just on general views that Reagan at the time was not too old. Now, historians will tell you that can cut both ways, because ultimately, as an older figure, he did face medically later issues around aging. But he was reelected with 49 states. And the question about medicine, just as with journalism, would be, are you working off facts and evidence and take that in? If you want to vote against someone for any number of facts that you gather, great. Or are we dealing with another kind of version of but her emails that's become but his memory when both candidates are similarly aged? Neither has faced any credible actual medical diagnosis that voters have to factor in at that level. And remember, there's also this whole thing about whether America wants to remain a democracy when only one of the candidates, the indicted one, is actively running on a plan to take over the Justice Department, to prosecute his enemies, to be a dictator some of the time, to wage a kind of anti-democratic war that might put January 6th to shame.